The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about cloud computing in a regulated environment. We'll take you through the next hour. My name is Evie Larson, and I am Communications Manager at Epista Life Science. Really appreciate your time today, and we are going to do our best to fill that time with some really valuable knowledge. Two of our subject matter experts are actually responsible for filling your head with that valuable knowledge. First of all, we have Susanna Key, and we have also Rasmus Torp Christensen, and you will hear much more from them in just a minute. But first, before we get into the subject matter of our webinar, I want to give you just a lightning version about who Epista is and why we're doing this webinar. And then I promise you won't hear any more about Epista for the rest of the hour. We, Epista Life Science, are a consultancy that is laser focused on continuously improving regulatory compliance. We do this both for our clients and also for the life science industry as a whole. We have this big ambition to influence the life science industry, and actually that's where this webinar fits in. We believe that sharing our knowledge is the best way to achieve that goal. So that's why we do activities like this webinar. As far as what we do, we help our clients in many ways. As you can see, we help them understand and conform to new regulations and technology, for example, cloud computing. We help them when they need to change their IT landscape. Also, for example, if you're going to a cloud IT landscape. And we help them figure out the optimal level of compliance activities for their company. And you can see more detail here. But that's enough about Epista for now. I just want to give you some practical details about the webinar. We want to get your input, so please chime in with your questions. There's a chat box on the webinar here, and we'll address the questions at the end of the session. Also, stay awake out there because we're going to be asking you some questions too. And finally, I just want to let everybody know so you don't wonder throughout this whole hour, I will be sending you the presentations after the webinar as a follow-up. With that information, that's all I have, and I will turn the microphone over to Rasmus, who will kick the webinar off.
Thank you, Evie, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll take you through this agenda during this presentation. And first of all, we'll start with a high-level introduction to what is cloud, some of the characteristics of the different cloud solutions on the market. Once that's done and we have established that baseline, we'll continue with a more deep dive into what kind of drivers we are seeing for going cloud. Because we're seeing some companies that are still reluctant going from an on-prem solution into the cloud, even though the cloud is getting more and more mainstream out there. Therefore, we will like to go through some pretty good reasons for going cloud. And then we come down and talk about some of the experience that we actually have seen in the pharmaceutical industry when we talk about cloud, when people move from on-prem to a cloud solutions. We'll be talking about some of the challenges and the advantages of going cloud. Last but not least, we'll go through the method that we use at Epista when we assist our clients in the cloud journey. Before we start with the cloud services, we have 3 polls that we'd like to begin with in order for us to be able to take the presentation in the direction that actually suits your answers or your needs. And the first one is, does your company have a cloud strategy? that a lot of you will answer this. We'll have the next one coming up quite soon. The next one, so we can actually see here that almost half of you have a pretty solid or have a cloud strategy already. Some of you are working on it, and for the rest, it seems like it's pretty early in the cloud journey. The second poll will be around, does your company have a process to qualify a cloud solution? You have 4 options that you can choose, kind of similar to the previous one. And be interesting to see how many of you actually have a process in place. Last chance. And here it's a little different. 30 or 32% is yes for a process. And then we have the rest in working on it and early stage of you. So it seems like some of you have a qualified solution without having a process for it. And the last one, do you have a qualified cloud solution within your company? And let's see the result. 3 seconds to go. And over half of you already have a qualified cloud solution within your company, and it seems like almost 20 or over 20% actually haven't started moving into or haven't qualified a cloud solution yet. Okay, thanks for that, and we'll continue on the cloud services. This is a cloud. And when we talk about cloud, we basically talk about 3 different types of clouds. So we have SaaS, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and a platform as a service as the last one. Common for all of these are that when you actually go cloud, you are outsourcing services to a provider. And these cloud services come in some different offerings. So we talk about private cloud. You can have a public cloud where you share it with other, and then you can basically have a hybrid solution where some of it is in the private and some of it will be in the public cloud. That all comes down to what kind of needs you have and requirements, and we'll be talking about that later on in the presentation. Some of the pretty characteristics when we talk about cloud and service providers is basically that when you are moving into the cloud, you basically outsource the responsibility for the operation and adequate services to a third-party provider.
Okay, Rasmus, thank you. I know probably some of you that already have moved into the cloud world do recognize some of what we are showing you now. There are different value drivers for when you actually decide to go cloud. Some of it could be scalability. It could also be cost and resources. It could be so that your company would like to focus on their core business. It could also be lack of knowledge of IT or professionalism, or you simply don't have the size to have this in-house. It could also be regulatory reasons and a competition reason if it's medical devices. And the benefits you get from here could be that you continuously have an improvement of your application and your services. That could be also, of course, a value driver, but it's mainly a benefit. You have large user groups that actually together with you can request new services, so you get a broader view on your requirements. You often have less operation and maintenance activities. You use the resources and the services at the provider. You have, and that's also often very beneficial for many of the companies, you have less qualification and validation effort because you share some of it with your provider, so you only do a minimal part yourself. You have often support 24/7, and one of the most important things right now is maybe that you have a more professional IT security setup. I'm sure most of you have heard all the lags and all the issues we have had with IT security. So this is a very important area right now. Also, when you go cloud, both as benefits, but also a challenge. We have tried to cover some of the good experience and the bad experience, and I will start with some of the good. I won't go through everything, but you get professional providers, and from my knowledge, being in this area since 2006, there are some very professional providers out there where you can get very impressive QMS and quality understanding. You might also find some of the others. You have a very good cooperation with them. You end up having less, as I said, validation effort. You have your incident and problem management functioning very well. You have a standard application possibility, and that are actually used by many other pharma companies. And also, if you decide to outsource your infrastructure, there are very much knowledge out there. You have a lot of input around your IT security and your understanding of your business area. Some of the more challenging or bad experience, you could say, is that I have discovered from some of those that I have worked together with, and this is not only one company, it's several companies. I've tried to gather some of it, that we have had some had a very late discovery of financial instability. They have also experienced that the infrastructure was unavailable for, if you have outsourced your infrastructure and it's unavailable due to a major incident for more than one day, for several days, it's actually not a very good experience for your business, so you can't continue your business. Some have experienced that test data was suddenly published into the production, and it was actually not discovered by anybody inside the company, but by an external user, which affect your reputation out there. So there are something that you have to look into, that you put up monitoring and controls and so on. I've also experienced myself and from others that they could experience poor quality of deliverables and services. So these are all, before I hand over to Rasmus, I would just say these are all very important things that you have to look into before you start up. And what you really have to remember is that you have the responsibility yourself. You can outsource all your services, but you cannot outsource the overall responsibility towards regulatory requirements and compliance. That stays with yourself. And then I will hand over to Rasmus.
Thank you, Susanne. With the bad experience in mind, we will take you through a journey. We call it Cloud Journey, and take you through 4 different phases. And the phases we go through with our customers when they want to go cloud and they want to be successful going cloud. And the journey that you see here basically consists of 4 different phases. So we have the planning, the implementation, operation and maintenance, and then we call it exit here. And we have experienced that using this one, and this is a pretty generic one in the pharmaceutical industry, but we are getting a lot more buy-in in general from all the organizations and the different departments within the organizations. We usually have specifically one department in each organization where they sometimes struggle to do the buy-in when methods are looking differently to what they usually use. Yeah, so we'll go through these four in a little while, and Susanne will start with the planning session.
Yes, the first phase is the planning phase, and before we actually start, I assume and I think most of you know that all projects, not only cloud but other projects, of course start with a business case where you actually look into what are you actually going to do and why do we have this need. But we won't touch much upon this here. So the first thing you have to decide is what are you actually going to outsource, which service model and to what extent. So is it an application? Is it your full infrastructure, or do you just have some servers where you have some data that you want to have outside your own company? Then you need to specify at least preliminary which services you need to outsource and which to remain in the pharma company. And when we talk about services, it's not only incident and problem management, it's also support, qualification, validation activities. So the full plate of what you could think of that might be outsourced. So you need to have that outlined, and you could start with mapping as is and what to be going forward. Then you need to have your specifications to your services and your quality specification, your quality as well. So specifications to the, if it's an application, you need to have a user requirement specification. If it's a full infrastructure that you want to outsource, it's maybe not just one small specification. You might have a large amount of specifications to various parts of the infrastructure. And then, of course, you also need to have quality requirements that could be specific to different areas. And in the beginning, you also want to assess and select the provider. And that could be in different ways. Mainly, what we do in the pharmaceutical industry is that we go on audit, but you could also assess in other ways. And of course, you need to assess their level of compliance. You need to assess their QMS maturity, their maturity to what they actually should deliver to you. The model do they have an application? How mature is that? Have they experience within infrastructure? Do they have an agile approach towards their development? What about data and security and so on? So the assessment of the provider needs to be in place. And then typically in the planning phase, you will also start up the contract negotiation, and you will start your quality planning and your quality risk assessment. The risk assessment will probably be in two phases, or that's at least what we have experienced and models we have looked into. So you have a more general risk and quality assessment, and then you might have some assessment that are more specific to the business area you want to outsource for, or maybe if it's within the domain, it could be within GCP. If it's something in GCP you want to outsource, then you might have very much interest in knowing the provider's security and knowledge about private data protection. And if it's medical devices, it's the ISO requirements that they need to know. And for financial, it could be Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. So some of the risk assessment are actually not just general risk assessment, but might be related to the area that you actually want to source out for. I think.
Yes. Thank you, Susanne. And we'll continue with the implementation phase. And when we start with the implementation phase, we actually divide this into two different tracks. One is the general quality management, and the other one is the qualification. If we double click on the quality management track, this is where we actually start to finalize the negotiation with the provider. And it's really important, as Susanna was saying, that we actually get the requirements from the business into these contracts, because it's pretty crucial once you are live that you can point to the contract and say, well, we actually need this and that when we are live. This is also here where you actually start to make the procedures for the operation and maintenance phase, get the different controls in place and stuff like that. On the qualification track, this is where we start with the overall quality planning, of course. We are finalizing and making the requirements, the specification of requirements even better. And this is also here we start to actually plan how to release whatever we have in cloud into a production area. And the purpose of this track is, of course, to fulfill all the business needs and quality and compliance for all the different phases in the life cycle going forward. When we talk about implementation, this is an example from one of our customers where they needed to have their or part of their infrastructure in the cloud. And these are some examples of different types of controls, so to speak, that were identified, and the company wanted to keep these thing in control. And this was a discussion between the pharma company and the provider. So which of these areas are you actually in charge of? What is required when we talk about periodic review, service desk, disaster recovery, and stuff like that. So it's pretty important, also looking back at the contract negotiation, that you actually ensure that the provider is capable of managing the things that you potentially are outsourcing to the provider.
Yes, and going forward in the implementation, we have actually put in again the same model, because that's also what some of our customers are discussing. How do you actually qualify different areas and different domains depending on the model? So again, you need to consider whether you have outsourced your full infrastructure. Is it only data you have outsourced? What area are you actually into? Is it GMP? Is it GCP? Is it ISO? Is it financial? What other business critical areas could you think of? So you have to have a scalable model where you can use your the right controls and the right level of qualification that you think would be sufficient for the area and for the model. So this is also a method that needs to go into your lifecycle model, where you define in your subs or in your governance model how you will react on this going forward. And here we have an example of split of responsibilities towards validation. And here it's an example where a customer have a service as a solution as a service. And here we can see that the split have been so that the provider actually do all the development, and they also take some of what we normally see in our V models in the pharmaceutical areas, that we do the IQ, OQ, PQ or UAT part, but here the split have been made so that it's actually the provider that have agreed to do the IQ/OQ. If you're gonna do these agreements, you actually have to ensure that their QMS is good enough and to the level of quality you need. So you have to add a quality agreement to your contract or your service agreement, whatever you call it. But you also need to have access to their documentation. So you need to have an agreement that you can both audit them, that their QMS is good enough, but also if you have inspection from or audits, that you actually have access to see their qualification documents. One of the challenges right now in the industry for at least applications is that many of the providers are using agile development methods where they develop in sprints. That could be a challenge if you use the V model as you see here, because that's not normally what we do in the pharma company. Normally we have all the development and then we do the IQ/OQ/PQ part. That could contradict with very often updates like every month, for instance. But as you can see from this model, the provider actually develops during using sprint, but the right side of the V model is still using the traditional waterfall models. But we have also experienced models where you have the validation inside the sprint, and it is actually possible, and it will make it more possible for companies to have upgrades with a shorter notice than maybe twice a year. Maybe you could go and have one every second month. Even you have to do a great part of the qualification yourself. So you have to consider carefully, both in the planning but also in the implementation, and when you do the governance model, how are you going to do this, and what kind of model or models do you want to use when you do qualification, and are there different ways to do it? Yes.
Thank you, Susanne. I'll continue on the operation and maintenance phase. And I guess both Susanne and I are referring pretty much to the planning phase all the time. And that the same goes for the operation and maintenance phase. Because this, of course, if you look at the timeline, this will be the longest phase of all of them, hopefully. And this is basically also here where you start to do the operation and maintenance of the solution that you have acquired. And this is an example from one of the customers that we where we did the cloud qualification, where we made this annual wheel. And this specific customer, they had some requirements for what they wanted to get on a daily or weekly basis, on a monthly, quarterly, and a yearly basis from the cloud provider. And actually, this customer was not able to fulfill their own QMS when they went live, because they were not able to actually get all of these information from the provider, and they hadn't secured that in the contract negotiation. So they had to go back and renegotiate the contract in order to actually get all of these controls into the operation and maintenance phase. If we are looking at a cost perspective, this is also most likely here where you can see a decrease in the amount of money that you're using on internal people, on hosting infrastructure or platforms. But on the other hand, you'll have to pay a fee to the actual provider in order to ensure that the stability and availability of the system is as you expect. It is, of course, really important also in this phase that you actually
Yes, and at last but not least, which are often actually forgotten, and you also have to remember that in your planning phase, sometimes you need to exit your agreement with your provider, and it's very, very smart to have at least thought about how do you exit this, and also to put it into, have it as part of your agreement. Because you need to have some change management when you exit your contract. It's not that easy if you have outsourced all your data and you're told, imagine it's your whole infrastructure and you want to change to another provider, or you have a lot of applications out there and then you also want to change to another provider. What do you then do? So I think it's a very good idea to have it in your contract, and also have maybe briefly discussed it with your provider, how you're gonna actually exit this contract. Sometimes you have to exit your contract with your provider, not because you want to, but because they have been bought by another provider. And that's often what we see. So you also have to think about, what if your contract is taken over by somebody else? What are you going to do about this? How do you set up change management activities to ensure that the new provider can take over the same responsibility, or if they can't, what else? So this is something you need to think about.
So at this point, we have basically taken you through some of the buying in criteria for going cloud. We have talked about how you can go from like the planning phase to the exit phase, and we are actually already ready to answer some of the questions that you may have. I don't know if did we receive anything already?
Yes, we got a question, and I think Susanna can answer the first question we received. Is that correct, Susanna?
Yeah, I will try to. I hope I understand it correctly, but otherwise, please correct me. As I see it, a public cloud service provider like AWS be used for GXP application hosting without the requirement for a dedication instance. As I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you use a GXP application in a public environment. It really depends on what kind of GXP application it is, whether you would like to have it in a public cloud. As I see it, some of the challenges with public cloud is that everybody could access your you don't know exactly where, for instance, if you have critical data, you don't know where they are stored, because public cloud means that it could actually be stored everywhere. And at least at least for EU, we have these new requirements for personal data protection, and therefore we are not allowed to have our data everywhere in the world. And you need, as a pharma company, to know exactly where your data are. So this is not something you can recommend if it's a clinical application where you have, or if you have any, it could also be other than clinical, but if you have any personal data in your application, you need to know exactly where they are stored. And this is not possible within a public cloud, because it could be stored anywhere. It could be taken over by different providers you even don't know. And in some countries, the law is actually so that if the data are stored there, they also own the data. And that is not either in compliance with regulatory requirements. So I can't recommend that, if that was the question.
I think we have one more question that Rasmus is going to take then.
All right. We have a question from one of you guys asking what are the most known pitfall. And I guess there might be a slight chance of me repeating myself, but it's basically looking at the contract. So before you actually sign the contract with the provider, make sure that the requirements you may have in order, for example, with the change management and how to control and the reports of the change management, that the provider actually can live up to these standards. Or maybe you have to go back and adjust your own QMS in order to actually fit to what the provider can give you. But it's really important that you do what you can in order to cover, so to speak, yourself in the contract negotiation. And this is also in that phase where you actually have the power to do so. So I think if I can point to one really important thing, for at least from my perspective, is that you take good care of the contract negotiation. Hope that was a sufficient answer.
And I can see we finally have one last question left. Susanna, can you take that question?
Yeah. Is it the same validation strategy that needs to be implemented in all areas of a pharma company? No. I think I can repeat that it is not. I think you should actually consider which validation strategy you need to use depending on what kind of domain we are talking about. Some of the domains do not need to have the same strict requirements as for GMP. And also some of the domains, it's not even possible. If you have a medical device that you cannot go very deep into, you might not be able to have the same validation strategy or qualification strategy for that area as you do for instance, an application or let's say you outsource your whole production area. That would be more GMP wise, and you need to have a lot of controls and approvals by QA and so on. So no, your validation strategy will definitely be different to my understanding and what I can hear from others, and the method we have implemented in different areas depending on the domain and depending on the model that you actually are using, the service model you are using.
It looks like we have one more question. Hang on just 1 second. And we'll...
Yeah.
Go ahead, Susanna.
Yeah, I can see if I can answer it. Do you have any viewpoint towards single tenant and multi-tenant? Customer decides when to upgrade, or suppliers decide when to upgrade? Yeah, that's a very good question. Sometimes you cannot, as a customer, decide to upgrade, and that's also why you need to find out or at least agree with your provider how you can do this, because as a pharma company we would like to decide ourselves when to upgrade our application or our structure, whatever it is, but sometimes it's not possible. And then you have, of course, to follow there. You have to align and you have to consider your IT strategy together with your provider. How you're going to do it, how you're going to ensure that they don't upgrade over your head, so to say. But sometimes what I have heard from others and what I have experienced myself is also, if you could experience that the provider you have a very good agreement with and have the IT strategy aligned, then they are bought by another provider, as I mentioned before, and then you have a new situation. So it's not, you have to be aware. You outsource something, you get some help, but you also lose control of something. You have to stick to control, you have to be in control yourself, but you also have to recognize that you give up some control, and upgrade could be where you actually have to be more pragmatic.
And we have another question. Hold on, we're checking it out. Just 1 second.
Shall I take that as well? Okay. I try to read it too, so all of you can see it. If we speak about infrastructure or platform as a service, and ensure built into the application that all data is encrypted from the application layer down through transport to the storage, is public domain cloud not acceptable for GXP applications. Again, it depends on what kind of data it is. You could say if you have everything encrypted, then you won't end up that your data are actually being accessible for others, because you have it encrypted and it's also encrypted in the storage, but still you don't know where they are stored, in which country, in which who actually owns the data. What I said before is some countries actually have laws that are very different from what we're used to in Europe. So if it could end up in a country where they actually ending up owning your data, that might not be something you're very interested in. Again, it depends on what kind of data you have out there. So it's both a yes and a no, so to say. I hope that was okay.
That's fantastic. Thanks everybody for all the good questions. If you have any more questions, now's the time to ask. We have one last poll to run, and we want to see if there's anything we can help you guys with beyond this webinar to answer questions about. If you need questions about tools, vendors, different strategies for different scenarios, governance, gap analysis, qualification plans, and the like. So go ahead and answer the poll if you have a chance. Cool. About 10 more seconds. I can see everybody's thinking about it. All right. Great. I'm going to close this now, so you have about 3 more seconds. And good. So we'll make sure we follow up on all of that. And before we say goodbye, I just want to thank everybody for their attention, for your excellent questions. A couple of practical details. Right after we end this session, like in a split second, you'll get an evaluation survey. It actually only has 3 questions. It'll take you about 10 seconds to answer. So please take a little bit of time and give us your input. We would really appreciate that. That helps us continuously improve. And I want to remind everybody, somebody asked on the questions, I will send the slides around as follow-up, so no worries there. And finally, you can find our contact details in the presentation, both Susanna and Rasmus. So you can also find contact details on our website, epista.com. We always are happy to share our experience, so please let us know if we can help you in any way. With that, we will conclude our webinar, and everyone have a great rest of the day. Thanks. Bye.